Yo, 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 dear listeners. It's your boy Ethan, the guy who makes grammar fun and pizza romantic, back to kick things off on Sip&Talk. Man, our last episode, Thought Experiment, Piggy Nation, and the Chubby China Dream, got a massive response. Holy pepperoni, you all went wild. Hey, we couldn't have done it without your amazing comments and inspiration sparking us along the way. Big thanks again to you, our awesome crew, and a shout out to our Taiwanese pals at the Sip, Stroll, Reflect show for firing up ideas back and forth with us. Today, we're diving into something a bit heavier, folks, the war between Ukraine and Russia. Yeah, it's serious, but let's unpack it together and see what's going on. Oh, and if I get too into it and accidentally record my voice yelling in the background, just bear with me, okay? Hit the comments with your thoughts, crew. All right, Sunny and Joe, take it away.
Today we're looking at stuff that touches on, well, some pretty connected global issues. We've got trade, defense dialogues, even active conflict zones.
Yeah, it's quite a mix.
So the mission really is just to cut through the noise, help you get a clear picture of what these sources are saying.
Distill it down.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this. We'll start with the latest on U.S.-China trade tensions, then shift over to some really direct comments on defense coming out of Southeast Asia.
That part's definitely interesting.
And then we'll cover the current situation in the war in Ukraine based on this material.
And looking at them together, you really see the connections, don't you? How one thing might influence another.
Absolutely. It's not just isolated events.
It's all part of that larger global picture.
Okay, so let's dive into that first topic, U.S.-China trade. The sources highlight a big announcement from President Trump about tariffs.
Yeah, that's right. The material points to President Trump planning to essentially double the tariffs on Chinese steel and aluminum.
Double them. Wow. And the reason cited?
Well, according to the sources, it's his view that China didn't hold up their end of a previous trade truce. Violated the terms, basically.
Okay, so from his perspective, a broken agreement. What was China's take on that?
Their reaction, as described, was pretty forceful. China's position is that these are unreasonable accusations.
Unreasonable.
Yeah, and they're saying the U.S. is the one creating new problems. They're calling for the U.S. to stick to the consensus they reached earlier in Geneva.
So a definite disagreement on who did what.
Right. Meanwhile, the sources say U.S. officials are indicating Trump plans to move forward with what they call a reciprocal tariff plan.
Got it. A clear he said, she said situation there. So looking forward, what do the sources suggest about the potential, economic impact, the outlook?
Well, the analyses included are definitely cautious. Moody's Analytics, for example, they expect some financial market volatility because of this.
Yeah.
They actually described the current trade truce as extremely fragile.
Extremely fragile.
And they pointed to two specific pressure points. One, around early July, when that 90-day tariff pause ends.
Right, the deadline.
And then another potential flashpoint in mid-August.
So the clock's ticking on that fragility. Is there any other analysis on whether these tariffs might actually, stick around?
Yeah, there is. The material mentions Julius Baer suggesting the tariffs are likely to persist at least for a while.
And their reasoning.
They think the U.S. government might actually need the revenue from these tariffs.
Yeah,
to help offset the earlier tax cuts.
Oh, interesting angle. So less about trade policy, more about fiscal needs.
That's the suggestion, yeah. It frames it a bit differently.
It really does. What about inflation? Did the sources mention the Fed's view?
They did. Federal Reserve Governor Christopher Waller is cited. He seems, less worried about tariff-induced inflation.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He predicts it would be temporary, minimal impact on jobs. He suggests the costs get split between consumers and businesses.
Okay.
And interestingly, even with all this, the possibility of interest rate cuts by the end of the year is still mentioned in that context.
So not seen as a major long-term threat to inflation or jobs, from that viewpoint at least. What about immediate market reactions? Did the sources cover that?
They did. Expectations mentioned were for a weak opening in Asian stocks. The U.S. dollar had its longest monthly slide, while the Japanese yen strengthened, U.S. futures were down. And kind of counterintuitively, oil prices actually rose.
Oil went up, even though OPEC Plus announced more supply.
Yeah, exactly. Bit strange on the surface.
But what's the thinking there?
Well, the interpretation offered in the material is that maybe the OPEC Plus move was strategic, perhaps aimed at punishing countries that overproduced. And maybe also, possibly, aligning with President Trump's desire for cheaper oil. It's a complex mix in the oil markets.
Definitely sounds like it. Okay, so let's connect this back for you, the listener. What does this U.S.-China trade friction mean?
Well, it really highlights how fast policy shifts can send ripples through everything.
Right, it's not just abstract numbers. These tensions are seen as potentially impacting market stability, maybe the cost of things you buy.
And just the overall confidence in the global economy. It shows how interconnected things are.
Okay, let's pivot now. The sources also cover another area of tension geopolitical defense. Specifically, some incredibly frank statements from the Philippine Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, this part was really striking.
He was speaking at the Shangri-La Dialogue, right? That big security conference in Singapore.
That's the one. Secretary Gilberto Teodoro. And the material really goes into detail on his remarks. He gave a very, very direct critique of China's actions in the South China Sea.
Which the Philippines calls the West Philippine Sea.
Exactly.
So how did he frame their position? Why so strong?
He was completely direct. Said the Philippines' stance is a direct result of what he called the overreach of the Chinese Communist Party.
Wow, overreach.
Yeah. And he specifically called out China's 9-line claim. You know, that line covering most of the sea.
Right, the controversial one.
Saying it has absolutely no basis in international law. A flat-out rejection.
It's a huge statement legally. Did he explain why there's such a trust issue from their perspective?
He did. He talked about a major trust deficit.
Yeah.
He felt even the way questions were phrased by Chinese representatives at the dialogue showed a gap.
How so?
He said it engenders a deficit of trust in China's words vis-a-vis its actions. He was blunt. Said China has a lot of trust building to do.
A lot of trust building.
And that he said very starkly that he cannot trust a country which imposes, represses its own people.
Wow. That is incredibly direct language for a diplomat at a forum like that. Did he give examples of this gap between words and actions?
Yes. The key example used was mischief reef. He pointed back to 1995, when China said structures there were just temporary havens for fishermen.
Okay, I remember that.
And then he contrasted that with today, a heavily militarized artificial island. He used that transformation to illustrate his point about promises versus reality.
A pretty clear example. Now, he also seemed to push back on the idea that the Philippines is just caught in the middle of the U.S.-China rivalry.
Yeah. Absolutely. He was very clear that their position isn't just about picking sides between the U.S. and China.
It's about their own interests.
Exactly. Protecting their own territory, their sovereignty. And he backed this up by pointing out that, according to him, no country in the world supports China's 9-line claim. Whereas he said no less than 50 countries condemn China's behavior in the region, and crucially, none condemn the Philippines. He really emphasized that multilateral angle.
That frames their position very differently. What about international law? That seems central.
It was absolutely central. He stressed that the whole international system needs to be based on the rule of law. Specifically, the UN Charter respecting independence, integrity, equality of states.
Especially for smaller nations.
Precisely. He argued there's no better alternative for the security and survival of smaller states. He even contrasted it with how ASEAN members handle their own overlapping claims cooperatively, he said, because there's trust.
Trust, which he says is missing with China.
Explicitly missing with China. And he urged smaller nations to fight for the UN Charter and UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea Convention. That's the framework for maritime issues.
So championing the rules.
Yeah.
How did he handle comparisons to how other ASEAN nations deal with China?
He rejected the comparison, emphasized that ASEAN members are sovereign, they make their own choices.
Okay.
He suggested if China did to, say, Malaysia what it's doing to the Philippines, Malaysia's reaction would be different and the Philippines would support them. He was also pretty dismissive of some questions he got. He called some questions from Chinese interlocutors propaganda spills disguised as questions.
Propaganda spills. That's quite a phrase. Were there other defense points mentioned from that dialogue in the sources?
Yes, briefly. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was mentioned, reassuring allies in the Indo-Pacific and urging them to boost defense spending. He linked it to a potential China-Taiwan scenario. China's absence from the dialogue was also noted, and Australia's Defense Minister Richard Marles apparently stated the U.S. presence is vital, partly due to a lack of transparency in China's military buildup.
Okay, so stepping back, what's the takeaway for you, the listener, from all this defense talk?
Well, these statements, especially the really candid ones from the Philippines, they just underscore the rising tensions in a critical global region.
And the focus on international law by a smaller nation really highlights how important, but maybe also how fragile those rules are.
Exactly. It's arguing that upholding these norms isn't just abstract. It's fundamental for security and stability everywhere, which affects everyone.
All right, let's move to the third major topic in your sources, the war between Ukraine and Russia. The material describes quite a bit of recent escalation.
Yeah, the picture painted is definitely one of intensification. The sources say Ukraine has been hitting targets deep inside Russia remotely.
Deep inside.
Yeah, while Russia at the same time has ramped up its bombing campaigns in Ukraine.
Okay, those remote attacks deep inside Russia, that sounds new, or at least a new level. What details did the sources provide?
They really highlighted major Ukrainian drone attacks, specifically mentioning ones around June 1st, 2025, hitting Russian air bases.
Air bases.
Yes, and the striking part is how deep they supposedly reached, including an air base reportedly in Siberia. That's thousands of kilometers from the front.
Siberia. Wow. How did they manage that, according to the sources?
The description used was extraordinarily daring. One method reported involved hiding drones inside, like, wooden cabins on trucks.
On trucks.
Driven by Russian drivers, apparently over huge distances, thousands of kilometers before launching.
That's audacious. And the impact?
The report cited suggests they hit or destroyed a significant number of aircraft. The numbers mentioned were 41 or over 40. And this was over 4,300 kilometers from the front line.
Hitting over 40 aircraft that far away, that's a serious blow. How is this framed?
President Zelensky is quoted calling it an absolute brilliant result, something for the history books. Analysts called it a potential turnaround point.
A turnaround point. Why?
Because it shows the effectiveness of, relatively cheap drones against very expensive military hardware. And Zelensky apparently said this specific attack was planned for 18 months.
18 months shows incredible long-term planning. How did Russia respond?
The response described was intense bombing. The sources mentioned Russia launching 355 drones recently.
355.
Yeah, causing casualties in Ukraine, 6 deaths, 24 injuries reported. There were mentions of brutal impulse bombing, too.
So serious escalation on both sides. What about near the border itself?
Putin was reported as saying Russia is creating a buffer zone along the border. And the sources also mention, though unconfirmed cause, 2 bridges collapsing inside Russia due to explosions.
Lots happening militarily. What about diplomacy? Any movement on peace talks mentioned?
There was a note about Russia sending a team to Turkey for a second round of talks scheduled for June 2nd, 2025.
Okay, so an attempt.
Yes, but the sources immediately added that Ukraine hadn't accepted the proposal yet. So, indicates very limited progress, really.
Right. Still seems stalled despite the meeting. Was there any analysis in the sources about Putin's strategy regarding talks?
There was some suggestion that Putin might be using these peace talk offers as a way to delay, maybe buy time to prepare a new offensive.
The delaying tactic.
Yeah, that interpretation was reportedly backed by a warning from some U.S. senators cited in the material. It also kind of fits with earlier info mentioned about previous talks in Istanbul, where Russia supposedly made extreme demands and showed no real willingness to compromise.
So diplomacy potentially being used tactically. What about the wider geopolitical context highlighted?
A major point raised is the potential impact of future U.S. policy. Specifically, the concern that if President Trump were to return to the White House, U.S. support for Ukraine could decrease significantly.
And that's seen as critical.
Very critical. The material frames reduced U.S. support as a potential victory for Putin, with experts warning it would hugely impact the war's trajectory.
The U.S. role seen as potentially decisive then. Any other international points?
It was mentioned that Western countries have apparently stopped setting limits on how Ukraine can use the weapons provided.
Okay, removing restrictions.
Also, a pretty stark economic point. Russian fossil fuel revenue is reportedly 3 times the amount of aid going to Ukraine.
Wow, 3 times. That puts the economic side in perspective.
Yeah. And briefly, there was a mention of the India-Pakistan situation. The Indian Chief of Defense Staff saying it's not close to nuclear war, citing communication channels and the gap before the nuclear threshold. They noted Indian officials didn't comment on Trump's claim about preventing a war there.
Got it. Okay, so pulling the Ukraine situation together for you, our listener, what's the picture?
The sources show a conflict escalating militarily, with these daring, deep strikes by Ukraine and intense responses from Russia. Diplomacy seems stalled.
And the future path seems really dependent on international support, right? Especially the future of U.S. policy, which is flagged as a huge question mark.
Definitely. And it's a reminder that this war has global consequences, energy prices, alliances, security focus worldwide. It's all interconnected.
So let's just quickly recap the main threads we pulled from your source material today.
Okay. We started with that renewed U.S.-China trade friction, the new tariff plans, the different stories about why, and the analysts worrying about market volatility and how fragile that truce is.
Right. Then we dug into those really strong statements from the Philippine defense minister challenging China directly on its actions and trustworthiness in the South China Sea and making a big case for international law.
A very forceful defense of the rules-based order.
And finally, the situation in Ukraine. Escalating conflict, Ukraine's effective drone strikes deep into Russia, Russia's heavy bombing response stalled peace talks.
And that big geopolitical question hanging over it all about future U.S. support.
Yeah. So these sources together, they really paint a picture of multiple global pressure points right now. Trade, territory, the very rules of international engagement being contested.
It's a lot happening simultaneously.
It is. And as we wrap up, thinking about how these sources touched on trade conflicts, defense postures, active war, and this constant theme of international law versus national interest, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Just how resilient is this rules-based international order that so many countries, especially the smaller ones, seem to depend on, especially when faced with these big power dynamics and national interests pushing against it?
That's a deep question. If it erodes, what comes next?
Exactly. What would alternatives look like? What would that mean for global stability, for trade, maybe even for freedom of navigation? Just something to think about as you process all this information.
Definitely food for thought.
So this has been our deep dive into the sources you shared. We really hope unpacking it like this helped give you a clearer view on these complex global developments.
Yeah, thanks for sharing the material and for tuning in.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us.